Today on the Urban Omnist, we're going to talk about good and evil. That's right, evil. Sounds so much better when you put it that way, doesn't it? Well, I'll tell you, this is a really intriguing subject to me because it lays at the very heart of so many different belief systems, particularly Western belief systems, the Judeo-Christian belief systems in particular. For this, I'm going to go into a bit of a scientific metaphor again, as I like to do on occasion. Hot and cold are two concepts that everybody understands. Probably since the beginning of time, we've had to understand the two words, hot and cold, regardless of what language they were spoken in. Now, as science started getting into the concept of thermodynamics, or should I say the science of thermodynamics, they started rephrasing this a bit. Instead of saying hot and cold, they said, well, there really is no cold. There's just thermal energy. And what we call hot is an excess of thermal energy. And what we call cold is when you're lacking thermal energy. So there is no hot and cold, there's just thermal energy and lack of thermal energy. Now, does that mean hot and cold don't exist? Well, of course not. Hot is always going to be hot and cold is always going to be cold. If you touch something that burns you, it's hot. If you touch something and it's incredibly cold, it's cold. But science rephrases it that way so that it can solve problems in a different way. They use it differently than simply our common hot and cold. If for no other reason than because that way it's not just relative. After all, when we say hot and cold, we mean hot compared to something colder or cold compared to something hotter. And they needed something that could be broken down into temperatures and numbers. Good and evil can be looked at in a very similar way. Keep in mind, I am not saying that there isn't good and evil. Obviously, that is a perfectly valid way of looking at, shall we say, good and not good behavior. But it's not, in my opinion, necessarily the best way of approaching the issue, at least not in modern times. A lot of Western systems of belief tend to circle around the idea, in one way or the other, of original sin, or something very much like it. Whether it be Persephone opening the box, or Adam and Eve falling from grace, we have this concept of some kind of a creator God creating something perfect, some type of utopian world, and we messed it up, or someone messed it up. In some ways, evil was introduced into this perfect system. And while that's certainly a perfectly good way of looking at the world, because it enables you to want to return to something good. And for a lot of people, that's heaven. That's the next world. Somehow we will move on to something better. And that will never cease to be true. I mean, good and evil is a perfectly good way of looking at the world. You know, as I said, looking at good behavior and bad behavior. But in some ways, I think that it's not always the most useful way of looking at the world, especially as we're coming into more and more modern times, and I think we're coming to have some greater understandings of things. Looking at the world as being broken, unfortunately, also causes us to sort of get stuck in many ways. Because we're looking forward to the next world, we don't always concentrate so much on how to make this world good. And a concept that I came into very early, even back when I was still very much Christian, was this idea that the world wasn't broken. That in fact the world was exactly what it was supposed to be. And that however you wanted to believe in the world being created, if you wanted to think of it as having a purpose, the way I looked at it was that that purpose was human evolution. That purpose was us in some way getting better. Gravity is a force that acts upon all of us. And if we had no reason to get up in the morning, we would just let it hold us to the ground. On the one hand, it keeps us from floating away, but on the other hand, it also keeps us stuck. But the need to go eat, the need to go use the restroom, the need to have sex, all these desires that we have cause us to get out of bed in the morning. And each time we stand up, each time we fight gravity, we build muscle. And to me, this is ultimately the way I look at good and evil. Every time you encounter adversity, any bad that happens, we learn from it. We somehow get better. We make a mistake, we learn not to make that mistake again. Or hopefully we learn not to make that mistake again. I think a lot of us have the attitude that why can't you just give us this list of rules like we have in, say, Christianity and most systems of belief. You should just be able to follow them, right? Parents will constantly say, if you just understood, I've been where you are, I went through my teens, I went through this, why can't you just listen to me? Well, the truth of the matter is a lot of us can't. There's some things that we're very good at sort of taking. Honestly, in my opinion, a lot of those things are things that, or should I say desires, that aren't necessarily a problem for us. Some of us don't have a problem with drugs. We've never had a problem with drugs, never had a great need to take them. And so we sort of hold up our fists and say, yay, I've never taken drugs. I'm a better, good person because of that. And unfortunately, a lot of those types of morality, I think, also learn to or tend toward a sense of of superiority. Superiority of morality. And to me, in many ways, the real purpose of life is doing the wrong thing. I'm not saying that you should go out and purposely do the wrong thing, but every time we do the wrong thing, that is actually how we learn. That is a function of the universe. That's literally how all of this works. We are given these conflicts in our life so that we can be better people. And so in that respect, all evil does ultimately lead to good. And so the ideas of good and evil are really more a dynamic where we are given these weaknesses and these desires, and as we overcome them, we become better people. After all, if the entire point of life was to just live a perfect life, I guess our parents could have just chained us to the bed and left us there our entire lives. I don't know that we would have learned much, but I guess we would have never sinned. But I don't think that's the point. I think the point actually is to sin. Again, I'm not endorsing sinning on purpose or doing bad things on purpose. I am saying that they lead to good. And this is something that in many ways I see all over the world. I see us having gone through a massive paradigm shift as we've been thrust together, as communication and travel, airplanes and computers and all of these things that are bringing us together and are forcing us to grow. Even though we had some massive, massive world wars, some of the worst wars we've ever had in the world, happened in the early 20th century. Very high body counts, second only to, strangely enough, some of the domestic wars that occurred in China. But something amazing about this is that the world did in many ways learn just how horrible war was. And since then, aside from a few very unfortunate wars that we've had, which were fortunately fairly small wars, for the most part, the world hasn't really gotten into massive war. I think in many ways we have learned from this. And this is where I come up with this concept that I spoke of in one of my earlier videos, talking about how ultimately, even though conflict may be necessary, or you could say evil if you wanted to, even though evil is necessary to cause us to grow, it doesn't always have to be violent. We are coming to a point in the world where things are more and more run by diplomacy. The monarchs have mostly been run out of the world to be replaced by one form of or the other of democracy, or at least things that are very similar to democracy. And what I find really good about this is that people in many ways are forced into dealing with each other in a different way. And I think to some extent we're all saying that. By being forced to deal with other cultures, people from other countries, we're coming to realize that just because someone looks different than us, just because someone has different ideas or different belief systems, doesn't make them stupid, and it doesn't make them wrong. And these are things you couldn't just tell people. You couldn't just come to all humanity and tell them this. It's not as if people from every single religion since the beginning of time hasn't tried to tell us things like this. Tell us to love other people. Tell us to treat people well. We had to learn. And in many ways, I think that the entire world is very slowly learning this. And right now, we are in the middle of that paradigm shift. And so, to some extent, in my opinion, looking at the world as not being broken, but being exactly what it is supposed to be. And instead of saying good and evil, simply looking at it as perhaps positive and negative, and slowly, hopefully, moving up the ladder to something more and more positive, and hopefully a growth in human evolution. I'm the Urban Omnist. Thank you guys for watching. Well, folks, today we're going to talk about the really interesting subject of good and evil. Yes, evil. Sounds so much worse when you say it that way, doesn't it? Well, I'll tell you. Good and evil is really just a whole bunch of letters strung together that Today on the Urban Omnist, the Blomnist, Blurban Blomnist, Urban Omnist Blomnist. And remember guys, none of this works without you. So, subscribe to our channel, like us on Facebook and Twitter, and above all, don't forget to send me those questions. Well folks, today we're going to talk about the really interesting subject of good and evil. Yes, evil. Sounds so much worse when you say it that way, doesn't it? Well, I'll tell you. Good and evil is really just a whole bunch of letters strung together that Today on the Urban Omnist, the Blomnist, Blurban Blomnist, Urban Omnist Blomnist. And remember guys, none of this works without you. So, subscribe to our channel, like us on Facebook and Twitter, and above all, don't forget to send me those questions.